Welcome to the Phoenix Conversations. Second chances, fresh starts, and powerful new chapters. I'm Lucy McCarraher. Each week on this podcast, I talk with people who've rebuilt their lives, who've faced endings, crossroads, and reinventions, and found new ways to rise. But this first episode is a little different because the person telling that story is me. Before I start sharing other people's journeys, I wanted to begin with my own and how my life fell apart when I turned 40 and how over the decades since, I've learned that reinvention isn't a single event, but a lifelong rhythm. From career collapse to unexpected family, from new ventures in my 60s to launching tech startups and podcasts in my 70s, this is the story of how I've learned to start over and over. So here it is, my own Phoenix story. When I was turning 40, my life fell apart. My 20-year marriage ended, and with it went the identity I'd had for most of my adult life. I got married very early at 20. And now I was no longer part of the couple that had defined me for 2 decades. My husband's family, who had been my closest friends, disappeared from my day-to-day life. I had to leave my much-loved job as Director of Development and Scriptwriter at ours video and TV production company and start my own business. I moved out of our big Victorian house into a tiny flat that barely fitted me and my 2 sons. Then my father died, and my new business failed. It was as if someone had swept the table clean of every piece of who I thought I was. All at once, the scaffolding of my life, marriage, family, career, belonging, collapsed. Turning 40 is generally considered the age you transition from youth into middle age. Mine was an extreme version of the transition from youth to middle age, but even without that level of drama, the shift can be disorientating. If you're a woman moving into the second cycle of life or into any new phase or decade after that, you may feel a sense of loss, a fear of fading out, an uncertainty about who you are or where you go from here, because your 40s have a different feel. You're no longer the young generation or the up-and-coming one. You've arrived, and yet now you're categorized by others and often by yourself as a mature human being. It can feel as if the best is behind you, but it isn't. At the time, though, I couldn't see that. I was grieving not just a marriage, but the person I'd been inside it. Now I was a single mother, self-employed, and uncertain. I felt really uncertain of who I was, like the solid edges of not just my life, but me as a person had dissolved. Of course, part of that was exciting. There were new possibilities, but I had no idea what they might be, who I might become, or where I was heading. My new business was going to be the thing, and then because our main client decided not to pay for a whole video we'd made for them, starring Gloria Hunniford and Janet Ellis, we had to go into receivership. In theory, I still owe Gloria Hunniford her fee. Reinvention doesn't always, or even often, as has happened to me a number of times, a friend of mine offered an unexpected lifeline. Sarah was doing some work for a parenting charity that she thought could use some PR support. And as I'd been in the media, she thought I could help and made the introductions. As it turned out, they wanted to promote a new idea for parents, something called work-life balance. This was back in the 90s. I'd never heard of it before, but I'm a quick study, as they say, so I went out and talked to some interested organisations like HSBC, for one. Then the Blair Labour government got in, changed the law and offered funding for free work-life balance consultancy for any business that applied. Our charity created a consultancy arm, and I went out and sold work-life balance consultancy to Microsoft, Virgin, big banks, blue chips, Magic Circle legal firms, the NHS, government departments and local authorities, and delivered the consultancy, ran team trials, focus groups, interviewed the C-suite. And for 10 years, I was a successful business consultant, not something I'd ever planned to be. But it also turned me into an author. My first two books were about work-life balance. At 40, I thought I'd lost everything and I was grasping at straws, but they weren't straws. They were the strands of a new phoenix nest. They were the steps of reinvention. I turned my life around, reframing pain as purpose, and in my early 40s I married again. My new husband was, and still is, 11 years younger than me. He had no children, and we planned to have a child. But it didn't happen. And the future we imagined together changed overnight when I learned that I was in early menopause. So we decided to adopt. My mother was in the childcare arena. She was the chair of Barnardo's and then the Thomas Coram Foundation, and she introduced us to inter-country adoption. It was a long, bureaucratic, emotionally exhausting process, and it required another kind of reinvention. I had to become vulnerable again, to prove myself capable of parenting to social workers, to prove to Russian bureaucrats that we could provide a good home to two undernourished and understimulated children from their pretty dire children's homes. When we had our two daughters, we moved out of London and into the Norfolk countryside. Aged 49, I was a schoolgate mum again, making friends with women in their 20s and 30s. I remember handing out invitations to my 50th birthday party and seeing the double takes, everyone thinking I must have typed the wrong number. I don't think it was that I looked 10 years younger than my age, it was that I was living younger. Back in playgroup, primary school, play dates, bedtime stories and horse riding lessons, and also running around the country as a work-life consultant. My boys were adults at university and art college, but I'd avoided empty nest syndrome by starting family life all over again and becoming a new mum. By the end of my 40s, I had built a new family, a career, a relocated home, and a sense of self. But reinvention never stays still. Just when you think you found your balance, life offers another invitation to change. I'd achieved a lot in my 40s, and yet by my early 50s, the tectonic plates shifted again. I'd taken time away from being a business consultant to write novels because, long story short, my first attempt at fiction had been shortlisted in the Richard and Judy novel competition and published by Macmillan. In fact, I thought that was my next reinvention. Lady novelist, living in the country, churning out literary books while raising horse-riding Russian daughters. But no. My husband became ill and couldn't work. My novels, which readers loved but not enough of them to make a living from, weren't going to cut it financially. Work-life balance had become mainstream and HR departments didn't need consultants anymore. We were running out of money. It was genuinely terrifying. I felt as if I'd wasted all the chances I'd had in life, a privileged upbringing, good education, endless opportunities, and not even created a sensible career that I could rely on for an income or a pension. I literally didn't know where to turn. And then, as happened before, the next cycle began almost by accident and through a friend. Mary mentioned a teaching diploma at our local further education college. It wasn't glamorous, qualifying to teach adults in the lifelong learning sector, but it came with a grant and a bursary. On paper, it looked like a sensible, small decision. But to me, it felt like a lifeline. I signed up. Going back to college in my mid-50s, I was the oldest in the class by nearly 20 years. At first, I thought with my age and experience it was going to be easy. And then I discovered how much education had changed since my English BA in the 70s. Learning new ideas and techniques was exciting and satisfying, but writing essays late at night after the girls were in bed was exhausting. But what I found was new energy. It was satisfying to stretch my mind, fun to sit in a classroom as a student and terrifying to teach real-life adults of all abilities in literacy and creative writing while supervised by a real-life teacher mentor who was also younger than me. Perhaps most importantly, I found myself among people of different generations, younger classmates who treated me not as a relic but as a wise peer, and that was unexpectedly healing. I didn't end up in teaching in the classroom. Luck, serendipity, fate, whatever you want to call it, and my irrepressible entrepreneurial streak gave me a new opening, and I used what I'd learned to build something new. That course didn't just give me skills, it gave me confidence and the conviction that I could still start over. Looking back, my 50s were about rebuilding, reconnecting with purpose, rediscovering that competence. Creativity and courage aren't gifts we lose with age, they're muscles we can keep strengthening. And here's a sidebar about reinvention. It can keep or make you young. Around that time, I came across Ellen Langer's famous counterclockwise experiment at Harvard. In the 1970s, she took a group of elderly men and immersed them for a week in the world of their youth. It was, in fact, a monastery, but she'd filled it with nice furniture, magazines, music, even newsreels and TV programs. There were no mirrors, only photos of the men when they were young. And they were totally treated as younger men. They weren't asked to pretend, they were asked to be their younger selves again. The results were astonishing. At the end of that week, they walked more easily, stood taller, were more flexible, laughed more, scored better on memory and vision tests. Langer's point wasn't that they literally grew younger, but that our perception of time and identity is far more flexible than we think. When the context changes, we change with it. That struck a deep chord with me. I'd already lived my own small counterclockwise moments when I started a new family in my 40s and became a student in my 40s, not by stepping back into the past, but by refusing to be trapped by it. Every time I've started over, I'm certain it's reset something in my brain. I've been forced to see myself differently. Student instead of expert, beginner instead of veteran, founder instead of retiree. What Langer's study revealed scientifically, I'd felt intuitively that how we think about ourselves shapes what we become. Reinvention, in that sense, is a kind of cognitive experiment. We change the frame and suddenly the picture looks new. Reinvention keeps us young. As I finished my teaching diploma and was not really looking forward to becoming a supply teacher, a small publishing company agreed to take on a book I'd written before my personal financial crash had happened. I met the publisher, Joe Gregory, who turned out to live in Norfolk too, at a local networking meeting. His business partner had just left, and I got the feeling he might be struggling. I offered my services and became his commissioning editor. Not the sensible career move I'd been aiming at with teaching, but much more exciting. 6 months later, I suggested we launch a new imprint called Rethink Press, aimed at entrepreneurs and using a more appropriate hybrid rather than traditional business model for publishing. It looked promising, but we couldn't be sure. We published a few titles, and then we were introduced by an author to the Key Person of Influence program run by Daniel Priestley. He asked me to become the publish mentor of this burgeoning entrepreneur accelerator program and mentor founders to write their books. I hadn't been in that arena before, but I had all the experience of training roomfuls of managers in work-life balance, structuring and writing fiction books, and teaching adults in creative writing. My next reinvention was as book mentor. And 13 years later, I am the UK's most experienced business book mentor, having worked with well over 1,000 entrepreneur authors to get their books written. By my late 50s, I was less afraid of endings and more excited by beginnings. I'd learned that a single small decision, saying yes to an offer, a course, or a chance or a conversation, can open a door you didn't even know was there. That was how Rethink Press was born, a publishing company for business authors who wanted to share their ideas, their purpose, their lessons, and have an asset for lead generation, visibility, and legacy. Through Rethink, I began to work with extraordinary people, coaches, entrepreneurs, speakers, thought leaders, creating clear and detailed processes, one of my superpowers, to help them capture their expertise and turn it into impact. Again, I was working with younger colleagues and clients and not feeling my age at all in terms of brain power or energy. And as I moved into my 60s, it felt like everything I'd done in the past, all the weird and seemingly unrelated cycles of my so-called career, had come together for this particular reinvention. That decade prepared me for what came next: creation, visibility, leadership. It reminded me that reinvention doesn't erase the past, it builds on it. Everything I'd lived through, the losses, the pivots, the learning, had been compost. Out of that mix, new growth was already stirring. In my 60s, what had sometimes felt like the chaos of earlier decades had settled into clarity. I no longer needed to prove to myself that I could survive. I wanted to create. If my 40s were about rebuilding and my 50s about rediscovering confidence, then my 60s were the decade of fire, of visibility, creation, and contribution. I had been helping others write their books, coaching, editing, midwifing their ideas into the world, and I saw how transformative that process was. Helping people find their voice reminded me of the power of story, so I built something around it. The Business Book Awards were a celebration of those voices. What began as a modest event quickly became an annual movement. Creation is itself a form of reinvention. Every time you make something new, a company, a book, a community, you also make a new version of yourself to lead it and inject it with personality and energy, and also failure and anger. The first year of the Business Book Awards, we had 11 brilliant winning books written by well-deserving authors, and every single one of them was a white man. I could have brushed it under the carpet, but I was actually angry enough to start a campaign to get more women to write and publish their business books. I wrote a book about it. It was my 12th book at that point, called A Book of One's Own, based on research I did that told me women lacked confidence about writing their books, believed that they lacked credibility, were scared of criticism, and even thought it was a selfish project to get into as it would take them away from their families and their businesses. I launched a series of women-only book writing programs which were enormously successful, and I spoke on platforms, podcasts, in the media and all over the place about why women didn't write their books and why they needed to. Women's voices need to be heard. Books give women credibility, confidence and authority. So I was now a campaigner for women as well, and by extension, other marginalised voices. The Business Book Awards became a platform for less visible authors of all kinds, and that's a legacy I'm really proud of. And my women's writing groups have morphed into my Mission Magic mastermind groups, so being a mastermind host is another mini reinvention for me. And finally, a tech bro and podcast host. At an age when many people talk about slowing down, I'm still living my counterclockwise moments. In the last few years, I've launched new ventures, including an AI tech startup. When AI suddenly became publicly available and threatened to change work, life, and creativity, I actually wasn't afraid of it. I was intrigued and interested and sure there was some opportunity here. It does annoy me when older people are characterized as backward looking, technically incompetent, and generally irrelevant. I knew something exciting was happening here. And when a tech developer in the Key Person of Influence program nonchalantly posted in the group chat that he was thinking of creating an app to help him write his book, I immediately got in touch and said, "This is something we have to do together. I know about writing books, you know about creating apps. We're the perfect team." Book Magic AI was launched a couple of years ago, attracted a big group of angel investors, and is growing into an extraordinary tool for not just planning and writing books, but for helping entrepreneurs to use their book as a key marketing tool to build their business. Jonathan Farrar is a superb tech partner who understands that human processes, honed over years in the real world with thousands of real people, is the best use for the extraordinary power of AI. Reinvention through creation feels different from reinvention through survival. One comes from necessity and acts on a particular kind of fuel, the other from desire to create something new in the world. I get a lot of pleasure from seeing the photos of the Book Magic AI founding team with me, a small white-haired woman, in the middle of a group of men about the age of my sons. I enjoy telling people that I'm a 70-year-old tech bro, partly to make them laugh, but also to make the serious point that AI and tech markets do not belong exclusively to younger men. I think my 60s taught me that visibility isn't vanity. It's vitality, the way you show up for yourself and for others. As the decade turned for me, I felt another change coming. It wasn't about business or achievement. It was a sense of freedom and lightness. Contrary to what you might expect, I look forward to hitting the age of 70, and it has not disappointed. I began to pay attention to my health in a way I never really had before. From being very slim for my first 4.5 decades, I had put on weight as soon as I hit my early menopause, and since COVID and lockdown, I had really got very heavy. Although my mind was sharp, physically I wasn't feeling great, and I knew I needed to do something about it, although all my efforts to diet and take exercise had ended in relapse. When I saw how effective weight loss drugs were being, I decided to give it a go. Gradually, and then quite dramatically over about 18 months, I lost 35 kilos, 5 stone, nearly a third of my body weight. I now feel incredibly energetic and well, physically as well as mentally, and feel the change as another reinvention. The other day, my brother said to me, "You're looking like you did when you were 17. It's really rather disturbing." And really, that's how I feel, counterclockwise at 70, back into the 17-year-old self I was with my life ahead of me. And why not think like that? All the science shows that how we feel about aging materially affects how we actually age, physically and mentally. It may be a clunky metaphor, but lightness of body has brought me extra lightness of mind, and I feel ready to fly, emotionally and spiritually. Perhaps that was what inspired me to launch The Year of Being 70, a weekly podcast with my lifelong friend Lisette Schoutemaker, who I've known since we were 7 and is just 1 month older than me. That became a space for exploring the paradox of growing older while feeling more alive than ever. Recording those weekly episodes of our podcast where we reviewed our long lives in decades, in themes, through the lens of being eldest daughters, baby boomers, and through our family contexts. And I felt the same thrill I'd had decades earlier when starting new ventures, but this time the energy was different. Not fiery, perhaps, but airy, expansive, playful. In this last year, which has just ended with our 71st birthdays, I reinvented myself as a podcast host who could be open, unashamed, able to share my thoughts, my beliefs, my inadequacies and failures, as well as strengths and successes, and share my true personality and what I've heard called one's cultural hinterland with anyone who's interested. Our final episode was 2 weeks ago. We reached a peak of 45,000 views on YouTube, which was really rather gratifying for a project that was started as more of a personal review. And having become addicted to the process of weekly podcasting, I decided to continue on my own with a professional team and focusing on the theme of reinvention with all the amazing people I know and am discovering who have created new lives for themselves out of the ashes of pain, fear, loss, illness, broken relationships, career endings, and so many other things. Age at its best can be liberation. In your 70s, you care less about the noise, you become bolder, not because you have more time, but because you finally understand how precious it is. It feels like I've come full circle. In my 40s, I'd been forced to let go of the life I knew. In my 70s, I'm choosing what to let go of and what to take on. And that's a much sweeter kind of freedom. Looking back now, I see my life not as a sequence of crises or successes, but as a series of regenerations. Becoming a business consultant after a life in the arts and media, adopting 2 Russian babies in my 40s after raising my first family and hitting early menopause, going back to college, becoming a grandmother. Oh, I forgot to mention that one earlier, and launching a publishing house in my 50s. Creating the Business Book Awards and founding a tech startup in my 60s, losing weight, launching the year of being 70, the Phoenix Conversations, and finding a new kind of lightness in my 60s. And I have a few more books on the go, fiction and non-fiction. I've cycled from a childhood of Chelsea privilege to midlife financial crisis, from parenting successive families to mentoring formidable business leaders, and buying and selling companies. At each turning point, I haven't just recovered, I've reimagined and regenerated. Reinvention isn't about recovery, it's about redesign. It's the art of using what life gives you, even the hardest parts, as material for what comes next. It isn't about erasing the past. It's about carrying it differently, recognizing that every previous version of yourself still lives somewhere inside you, each with something to offer. Every time you think you've reached a conclusion, another cycle begins. Aging doesn't narrow life, it deepens it. Starting over isn't a failure of continuity. It's a form of creativity. And the single most valuable lesson from all these decades of starting over is this: we don't just survive change, we become more ourselves every time we go through it. When I was 40, I thought my life was over. Now I see that it was only beginning its most interesting chapter. Reinvention isn't something that happens once in midlife and then stops. It's a lifelong rhythm, a pulse that beats beneath every new beginning. I used to think my rather random series of reinvented career moves meant there wasn't much coherence to my life. But my friend Melanie Gow, in her previous incarnation of Legend Maker, took me through something called the timeline exercise, looking at my life in decades and reinventions. She asked me if I couldn't see the theme that underpinned my whole life. I shook my head. Not at all. Lucy, she said, everything you've done has been about giving a platform to unheard voices. And there it was. Reinvention after reinvention, but all dedicated to a deeper mission that I wasn't even aware of. From starting an Australian theatre magazine in my 20s, to writing environmental and international children's TV series in my 30s, to raising attention for working parents, giving entrepreneurs a writing and publishing platform, and you know the rest. We all have moments when everything we know dissolves and we have to start again. Those moments aren't interruptions to life's journey, they are the journey. And there is coherence and through lines in every life. Each time the process gets a little less frightening and a little more familiar. You start to trust the fall because you know you'll rise. You stop asking, why me? And start asking, what now? Endings aren't punishments, they're invitations. I've lived through 4 decades of reinvention, and I expect there will be more to come. The details will change, the work, the people, the passions, but the principle remains the same. To live fully is to live in motion. To reinvent is to stay alive. And that, I suppose, is what all these stories, mine and soon other people's, are really about. The courage to start over and over and that was the first episode of the Phoenix Conversations. And I hope my story has given you a sense of what this series is all about. Not just survival, but transformation. In the coming weeks, I'll be speaking with guests who've faced their own turning points. Men and women who've lost, changed, reinvented, and come through it all with a deeper sense of purpose. If this episode resonated with you, please like, follow and subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening, and connect with me on LinkedIn, YouTube and social media. There's only one Lucy McCarraher, and I'd love to hear your story of starting over too, because every new beginning, however unexpected, is a chance to rise again.